in person and on Zoom. There are source sheets here, and those who are, hold on, we have to share my screen again, and we'll be there. Okay. Just trying to, just 1 second. This is not my, Curly is a tech person. It's okay. I got it. You're all stemmed out. I got you. You're all stemmed out. No stem left. Okay. So we are perfect. Okay. So we have explored a number of remarkable women in the Talmud throughout this this series. We spoke about Bruria. We spoke about Yalta. We spoke about Ima Shalom. Last time we learned about Helene Amalka. Today, we're going to learn about Amsei de Rabbi. Amsei de Rabbi, the maid of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Here too, as we have mentioned in the past, was this one woman? Was this a composite of stories told about a number of women that were, collated together, and all of them were identified and named by one name in the Talmud? Sort of a little bit of a difference of opinion in some sources that mention the hired help of Rebbe. It talks about the maidservant, and other times it'll mention it as a maidservant of, right, without the hey hayidiyah or the equivalent in Aramaic of being the one. There seems to have been one that was particularly well known, and about which most, all of the stories that we're going to review refer to. But there may have been other women, and Amsei de Rebbe is not necessarily one woman, but a composite of women, maybe all of whom were hired help of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, maybe of other rabbinic, Talmudic, rabbinic personalities. What do we know about? So far in this series, we've noticed. Let's contrast an Ima Shalom and a Helene Amalka. Ima Shalom was all about her relationship to her husband's family and her father's family. And again, being born into these families doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to follow in the leadership and in the knowledge of these families, but nonetheless, it situates you in a situation whereby you are primed, let's say, for these opportunities. Contrast that to Helene Amalka, who yes was royalty, but had no connection, no family connection, no cultural ethnic connection to Judaism, and yet on her own, in her own way, and at her own desire and volition, makes the move, converts to Judaism, supports the land of Israel, moves to Israel, buried in Israel, all that stuff, her and her family. So we have these differences. Amsei de Rebbe is a little bit of both. On the one hand, this figure, this maid of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, was in proximity to the great Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the redactor, editor, compiler of the Mishnah. And on the other, so that put her in a position to be familiar with Torah thought, Jewish teachings, the center of power for the compilation of the Mishnah. But that didn't necessarily mean that she would be a person of note. She could have just been the maid, but it was the combination of innate talents with opportunities that presented themselves come together and create this portrait of Amsei de Rebbe. What do we know about Amsei de Rebbe? So, for instance, in the Talmud and Shabbat, page 152, it tells us that she was unique in her vigor even at an old age. Right? There's a story that's not so important for our purposes based on a pasuk in Shmuel that suggests that when a person reaches an elderly age, they are no longer able to be as discerning in their taste, discerning in their senses. But comes along Rav and says that's not always the case. Just because a person is elderly, is 80 years old, does not automatically define them. Their age does not define them, because the example is we have Amte the Rabbi. There was a particular maidservant in the house of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, underline phrase towards the end of source number 1. There was a particular maidservant of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi who was 92 years old, and she would taste the food that was cooking in the pots. In other words, she was the official food taster, right, to ensure that it was seasoned right, it was cooked correctly. She had a discerning taste. And remember, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was not just well known, renowned for his Talmudic knowledge, but he was also tremendously wealthy. So the food taster in his home had to have a discerning taste. And the Amte Rebbe, this woman, because it's not just a fact, it's not just like a Ripley's Believe It or Not, right? 92-year-old woman is able to be the taste tester at the famed Judah the Prince's home. No, it was meant to shed light on this particular character and suggest that she was worthy of a certain blessing. As we might say, right, there's the blessing of Arichat Yamim is not just in terms of quantity of age, but the ability to be vigorous till the later stages and ages of life. And so therefore that's what Rabbi is really telling us. It's sort of a secondary point, a tangential point, that not everyone who's over the age of 80 is no longer useful when it comes to these precise sorts of tests. But also we learned something about Amte Rebbe, that she was a unique character. What made her unique? So we are the Gemara in Megillah. That's a long piece. That's why the source sheet is so long. But we're not going to go. It's 4 different instances where Amte Rebbe was used as a living, breathing dictionary. In other words, there were terms that were used in Tanakh. There were terms that are used more so in the Talmud, rabbinic terms that right. And on occasion, obviously this was not always the case, but we can tell from the back and forth of Talmud that on occasion the oral tradition was transmitted in such a way that the words might have been precise, but the understanding of those words, there was room for discussion of what it meant, right? And that's how you get the Gemara, right? You have, this is what was said. Is that really what was said? Yes, that's really what was said. But what does it mean, right? So there was the tradition in terms of the literal words and the Talmudic interpretation and the practical application of those traditions. So for instance, the Mishnah in Megillah tells us Hakore l'seirugin yatsa. The Mishnah says that if you read the Megillah seirugin, then you're yotze, right? So that got passed down from teacher to student, and then a point in time came where there was some ambiguity, or the definition, the translation of what seirugin meant in this particular case was lost. They didn't know what it meant. Right, so the Gemara that's in Megillah 18:8 tells us, so they didn't know what the word seirugin meant, and how does it relate? Whatever way you translate it, how are you going to apply it to the rule that was not under dispute? Hakore l'seirugin, applicable to the reading of Megillah coming up next week. Yotza, right? If you read the Megillah seirugin, you're yotze. They didn't know what that meant until one day, right? Get to the underlined phrase. One day they heard the maidservant in Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's house saying to the sages who were entering the house intermittently rather than in a single group, how long are you going to enter seirugin? So they were kind of like trickling in a few people, and then another few people, and then another few people. And obviously one of the roles that she had, as we'll see later on, was that she was the door attendant. Someone came to the door, she had the access, right? She was the one who granted access. So these students, these colleagues were coming in, and she's exasperated a little bit. She says, why are you coming in seirugin? And that's how they knew, right? That seirugin means, drips and drabs. Not all at once, but slowly, a few at a time. and that seems to be a dispositive proof that that's what the word means. Partially granted because it was a tradition that came out of Rebbe's house, the great Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. But one cannot ignore the fact that the transmitter of this tradition was none other than the maid of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, right? It's not his student, it's not his son, but it's Amdei de Rabbi that we are relying on to interpret this word. And there are a number of instances, right, in the Gemara and Megillah that show that this was not just a one-off. If it was a one-off, you could say, "Oh, she got lucky," or that word was thrown around a lot in the Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's house. No, but this is something that she seemed to have been able to help the rabbis of the time in a number of instances. There was a word chalogalo goat found in a number of Mishnayot and Braitot. Weren't sure exactly what the word meant until one day, once again, the Amti Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said that they were scattering around a certain type of herb, and they said, "How long are you going to scatter your chalogal goat?" So now they knew what chalogal goat was. There was a living tradition about the definition of a word, the definition of a category, right? We have a number of other examples. Sal Salaha. This is a pasuk in Mishlei. We actually, right? They at that time they didn't know what it meant. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's maid saw a man twirling his hair and said, "How long will you be misalsel your hair?" That's how they knew it, right? So that's how. And one last example about a broom, a phrase, a pasuk in Yeshaya. Not sure exactly what tate and matate means until Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's maid was heard saying, "Take the tate and metate the house," right? Take the broom and sweep out the house, which was then understood that that's the word, that's what it means in Yeshaya, right? So, Amte de Rabbi, where did she get this knowledge from? Presumably from the home in which she worked. The fact that she is quoted as being the preserver, the reminder, not the innovator, but the preserver of this tradition, of this philology, of these translations, of these explanations of these words, is certainly noteworthy, and it speaks. We don't know how she learned. We don't know if she learned. We don't know how she absorbed these lessons. Were these just the language in the house of Rabbi? Was she overhearing, rabbinic discourse and conversations? We don't necessarily know, but we do know that she is believed and credited with preserving the tradition on these words, both from the rabbinic usage from a couple of these examples, like Serugin, as well as Psukim from Tanakh. She heard it from someone, right? It's interesting. So is this
Where did you hear? And then
right?
That what was put down in the bar was her, not
correct. So my thought, right? So my thought on that is obviously she heard it from someone, and probably from Yehuda Hanasi. It could be that because these are areas of general knowledge and not halacha, they were not as particular to have a rabbinic tradition as to the authority of this. She just had to be correct. She didn't have to have, smicha to paskin. Because well, what I would say is because of where she worked and because of who she was. Right? It was that combination. Correct. And that she was knowledgeable and that she utilized this language, not just something she heard, but she incorporated it into her own. Right. Well, yes, then it would make sense that whether this happened before or after, that type of persona would be someone whom later in life we would want to attribute to a blessing, like, having your faculties at 92, because you utilized your position in Rebbe's house to further the knowledge base, right? Further the knowledge base of the interpretations of these words, for instance. There's another example of that, the Gemara in Eruvin, right? right? Again, about philology, about the way she spoke, about what she said, right? A contrast between the way Galileans speak and the way the house of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi spoke, which was further south, right? In contrast, not so important exactly, but they considered this Talmudic piece in Eruvin considers the linguistic tendency of the Galileans to be imprecise, right? 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 You know, it doesn't work quite as well in translation. That's not really the point. In contrast to the speech of the Galileans, which indicates ignorance, the Gemara cites examples of the clever phraseology of the inhabitants of Judea and the sages. The maidservant in the house of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, when she would speak enigmatically, employing euphemistic terminology or in riddles, she would say as follows: the ladle used for drawing wine from the jug is already knocking against the bottom of the jug, right? Which was meant to mean the wine jug's almost empty. Let the eagles fly to their nest. The students go home, right? Closing time at the bar. There's nothing else to drink. Well, you know, they only drank wine, right? Water was poison. So they weren't, you know, water was poison. So they were last call, right? So she was clever in the way that she spoke. Again, it's not necessarily, she didn't necessarily originate this type of cleverness, but she is credited with perpetuating it and being a source of, standing up as an example for this type. So again, it's not just what she did, but obviously there's more to who she was that allows the rabbis and makes the rabbi, the Talmud, comfortable with quoting her and using her as an example for these, to speak about language, right? To speak about the way language was used and could be used and needed to be used and was appropriate to be used. The just as we're going to at the end of the shir spend a little bit of time about one area so far. The maid of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's contribution has all been in the realm of language, linguistics, philology, interpretation, dictionary. At the end, we may give an example where later poskim have looked at one of the examples of Amtei Rebbe and found very important halachic significance to what she did. But another example of just a side point that she gets mentioned in passing is the Gemara of Mitzvah, which is a fascinating Gemara, not so much about the role, not so much because of the role of Amtei Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, but because of what it says about the need, the way in which the Talmud views how Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was judged. He had a very difficult end of his life. A tremendous amount of pain was associated with it. We'll see in a little bit. And what it says about cruelty to animals, right? So, as we'll see in the last Gemara from the Gemara in Ketubot, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi suffered at the end of his life tremendously. And the Gemara asks, why did he suffer? Only the Talmud can ask these questions, right? But this is the answer that they give. The Gemara answers, there was a certain calf that was being led to slaughter. The calf went and hung its head on the corner of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's garment and was weeping. In other words, the calf didn't want to go. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said to the calf, go as you were created for this purpose. The kach no tzarta, right? In other words, we do believe that animals can be eaten. We don't certainly in a post Gan Eden world, right? Post flood world, we believe that animals can be eaten. But that doesn't mean that there's no requirement of a degree of once they're dead, you can eat them. While they're alive, right? There has to be a certain awareness, a certain sensitivity, right? It was said in heaven, since he was not compassionate toward the calf, let afflictions come upon him, right? There's a fascinating discussion because, especially in light of a Mishnah at the end of Megillah, that tells us that when it comes to the mitzvah of shooing away the mother bird, right? We're not supposed to say that the purpose of shooing away the mother bird is to show compassion, right? And yet, so what does that mean? But obviously what we see is that you have to have compassion. The problem there seems to be that we are hanging our hat as if we know exactly what the purpose of every mitzvah is. That we're supposed to have a certain degree of humility. We don't know why there's a mitzvah. Yeah, it seems that compassion could be a very compelling, persuasive reason for shooing away a mother bird before you take her chicks or before you take her eggs, but that's not the be-all, end-all reason for that mitzvah. But the idea that there's that built into the system is compassion towards even animals, the Gemara Bava Metzia sees very clearly and suggests that that is a reason for that can be attributed to the afflictions, to the pain and suffering of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi at the end of his life. Nonetheless, the Gemara says that the suffering was not quite as intense after a certain episode that involves Amtei Rebbe. That these particularly onerous and painful illness left him due to another incident. One day, the maid of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was sweeping his house, and there were weasels lying about, and she was in the process of just bopping the weasels. Isn't there a song about bopping weasels on heads, right? Right? Sweeping them out. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said, let them be, based on a pasuk, Rachamav al kol ma'asav. Right? The pasuk in Ashrei that Hashem has compassion over all his works, so let's partner with him. You can shoo them out, but you don't have to bop him on the head. They said in heaven, since he was compassionate, we shall be compassionate on him. Relieved his suffering, didn't remove his suffering completely. You know, there are other Talmudic passages that talk about comparative suffering. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's up there. Some people suffered a little bit more, but he was pretty up there even after some of this suffering was relieved. So that's just an incident where the maid of Rebbe is not following, right? In what, or maybe that's what he told her to do generally. Then he had a change of thought, change of heart, and he wanted to be a little bit more compassionate to the rodents in his house. But here's where, as opposed to up till now, it's been the maid of Rebbe being a continuum, a continuation, a legitimate holder of the tradition. Here it seems that she was acting in a way that he wanted her to change, right? Maybe again, we don't know what was going on before that. What was the pest control policies in Rebbe's house beforehand? But here she was doing something where Rebbe intervenes and tells her to do it a different way. Similarly, again, that's not here. Here again, we're not quite at halacha. We're at midot tova, right? How do you act towards animals? I mean, Sar B'alei Chaim is a real mitzvah, don't get me wrong, but sort of the gradations of which even Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi had a change of heart over the course of his lifetime, and Rebbe's maidservant seemingly did as well. So in addition to philology, we have some of these, what's the right mido to have? The Gemara Nida gives us an instance where there was a halachic incident where Ravada says in the name of Yitzchak, there was an incident involving the Amtei Rebbe, the maidservant of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who immersed herself, and she went to mikvah. She got out of the mikvah, and there was a piece of bone found between her teeth. Right, so there's a whole question whether a piece of bone between her teeth. Generally, if you're right on one foot, we would say if you're still at the mikvah, go back and dunk again. If you're already home, then probably not. It doesn't count. The practical halacha is that it generally does not count as a chatzitza. That's ma'akev that forces you to go back if it's minor, right? If it's a minor thing. Nonetheless, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi required her to perform another immersion, right? So we see that he was her posek, that she would go to him obviously for halacha as well. One of the interesting things that we're not going to get so in depth in is, what was the stat like? Was this Amtei Rebbe, was she Jewish or not Jewish? She's going to the mikvah, she's probably Jewish. But nonetheless, some of the Rishonim and later on try to categorize her. Where exactly does she fit in? It's easier to assume that she's Jewish, both with these stories as well as the other instances where we're going to learn something from her. It's just easier to understand that her role was one of an insider, as opposed to like a Helani Amalka or something like that. But it is a question that some ask. Talking about the next Yerushalmi is, I looked for more explanations of this, a little bit more. This is something they don't tell you about Amtei Rebbe usually, and remember, like in Bruria, right, parts of the Bruria story are left out. This is not quite as bad. This is certainly not as bad. She does not look as bad, but it's certainly PG or more, right? There was the case of one who propositioned Amtei Rebbe, right? And this is, by the way, this is the example of where the interpretation is that she was not Jewish, right? We'll see in a minute. There was a case in which one, right, propositioned the maidservant of Rabbi. She said to him, if my mistress is not immersed, neither do I. So she said, I didn't go to mikvah, or it means I won't be able to go to the mikvah. One of the two. In other words, it's not appropriate. So he said to her, but are you not as a beast, right? Because non-Jewish Eved, an Eved Kanani, a Shifcha Kananit, has the halachic status of property, right? Has the halachic status of property, right? You can sell a slave, right? When slavery existed, you have to treat them well, but they're considered to be property. So this man wanted to extend that status, assuming that this Amte Rebbe, maybe it was the same one, maybe it was a different one, but that's how the story goes, to extend it to the fact that, oh, you don't have to go to the mikveh. It's fine. Right? You're not Jewish, you're fine, it's not a problem. She said, okay, if I'm not Jewish, have you not heard of the punishment, right? There's a right? If I'm not Jewish and I don't have to go to the mikveh because I'm like an animal, then you're in violation of bestiality, right? So here too, questions about her status as opposed to the other cases, because here it seems that the presentation is one of being non-Jewish, but the cleverness of her argument, her familiarity with biblical text, and her gumption, right? Her willingness to sort of stand up to someone, especially if she was in a position of being granted. She was in Rebbe's house, but she was a maid, she was a slave maybe, and nonetheless, her willingness to stand up to this person who is clearly doing something incorrect speaks to whether it's the same woman or another woman who is overlaid with Amte Rebbe, sort of this idea of the confidence and the gumption that this character has in this story, even to stand up to someone who is in a different caste than they were. The source number 7 tells us a story in Moed Katan, which begins to have, here's an example of a possible halachic ramification to Amte Rebbe. Right, let's take source number 6, the Yerushalmi, as an outlier, whereby the Amte Rebbe is not Jewish. Let's assume that the rest of the sources, maybe it's an outlier, maybe it's to emphasize her confidence, or willing to stand up for what was right and what she believed in. But by and large, the rest of the sources can be understood, and probably are understood, as her being a Jewish maid servant in the house of Rebbe. But so what happens here? So this is a story in Moed Katan about cherem. We talked about this, right? Like formal excommunication from the community. If a person is in cherem, they can't come to shul, they can't be part of a minyan. When they die, they can't have a regular funeral. Right? It had real impact on a person's life. So they're talking about who can create cherem, who can create this ostracism or this excommunication, and if a person is put into cherem, who can take him out of cherem? Does it have to be the same person? Could it be just another rabbi? Could it be any rabbi? Does it have to be the Sanhedrin, the greatest Beit Din of the time? So at some point, Rosh Shmuel Bar Nachmani rose up on his feet and said, if the maidservant in the house of Rabbi Hanasi, once ostracized, once excommunicated a person, and the sages did not relate frivolously to her decree of ostracism, right? And it did not revoke it until 3 years had passed. All the more so do we have to take this particular case seriously. In other words, there's a story that was told about a person who was put into cherem by none other than Amte Rebbe, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's maid, and they were unwilling to just ignore it. They took it seriously, and there was a process in which it had to be resolved. What's that story? So the bottom of page 2 tells us the story. The story is as follows: that the maidservant in Rabbi Yehuda's house, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's house, saw a certain man who was striking his adult son. And we know corporal punishment is okay. We're not against it as long as it's appropriate, right? Spanking could be okay, again, but it depends. But they say here that if it's an adult child, right, over 13, over 12, then you run into a problem that if you hit, they might hit back. If they hit back, then they could violate a very serious prohibition of striking or drawing blood from a parent. So you got to be careful. One could suggest that applies even to younger children today. I'm not going to get into that topic broadly, but we see that, it's striking an adult child, even if technically it could be understood as permissible as a parent's right, nonetheless is frowned upon as a potential violation of Lifnei Iver Lo Titin Mitzvah. Don't put a stumbling block in front of the blind. You hit a kid, the kid hits you back, you put a stumbling block in front of them. Had you not hit them, they wouldn't have hit you. And therefore, Meisur of Rebbe saw this adult father hitting his adult child, and she said you should be excommunicated because you are violating, placing a stumbling block before the blind. And she was and that ostracism remained. That cherem stayed in place. It took 3 years to resolve that issue. In other words, her words were taken seriously. So what does that tell us about Amta Rebbe? So the Rambam says it doesn't tell us really anything except the fact that she was Jewish. Because look at this top source number 8. The Rambam says very clearly that we have to take seriously anyone's statement of cherem if it's for a legitimate reason, right? Person who was placed under a ban of ostracism for another reason for which such a ban may be declared, right? Not because of something they said about a particular rabbi, but for another reason. Even if the ban was declared by a person of the lowest stature in Israel, then everyone, the Nasi and all Jews, are obligated to abide by the terms of the ban until that person repents for the matter for which the ban was imposed and the ban is lifted, right? So you have to take seriously, right? There's a statement in Talmud, you have to take seriously the blessing of even a very simple person. So the Rambam holds you have to take seriously even the cherem of the lowest rung on the social stratosphere, as long as it was legitimate, as long as the cherem was put into place because of a real legitimate violation where cherem is appropriate. But it doesn't matter who it is. It can even be Amta Rebbe. She's Jewish, but she's low on the totem pole. But we're going to see maybe yes, but maybe it tells us something else, right? So far, we haven't seen any. Any halachot that emerged from Amta Rebbe, from the maid, and therefore through the prism of the Rambam, we don't necessarily know anything about how they viewed. Maybe the lesson here is even the maid of Rebbe can create an effective cherem, maybe. But then we come to the Gemaras in Ketubot, which talk about the end of Rebbe's life. Before we get into that, if you just turn the page, because last time when we did Helni Amalka, I had a lot of fun with places in Israel. So I wanted to give us one more on the last hurrah, give us one more spot in Israel. And this is Beit Shearim, right? And as we see described here, Beit Shearim from their website encompasses the excavated site of a Jewish Roman era city and a complex of Jewish burial caves on the lower hillside. It's about 20 kilometers from Haifa, in the lower Galilee, and it's a UNESCO listed archaeological park, right? It's, you can't get the Kotel listed in UNESCO, but Beit Shearim is listed in UNESCO for its remarkable necropolis and catacombs that held coffins dating back to the 2nd and 5th century. Right, they go all the way back. This one that you're looking at, the Cave of the Coffins, had over 130 different niches, sarcophagi within the complex. It's tremendous. And they have the spot where they believe was where the kever of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was. It's straight back to the right. Right? It's not there anymore. Right? As we see here, right, this was a place of Jewish, this was an area close by where the Sanhedrin met, Beit Shearim, where Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi lived, where he compiled the Mishnah, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is buried there as well. So, and we think that inside this cave of coffins is where it was. The wealthy, right? So this is one of these cases where Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is buried there, and then for years and years, centuries, people wanted to be buried near Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So it's a huge necropolis. But already 500, 600 years ago, the graves had been completely robbed. There's nothing left. Every sarcophagus has like this little chiseled out area where the grave robbers would chisel out a piece of the sarcophagus. It's all soft limestone, and they'd stick in their hands and take whatever people were buried in, including the bones. And there's nothing left. Every single sarcophagus looks like that. But nonetheless, it's really an amazing sight. I was just in Israel Thanksgiving. Rebecca and Yaakov and I went one day towards the north. We went to Zichron Yaakov, and we went to Beit Sharim, and we got to see it. It's really a very cool site that I had never been to before. And so that's where the kever of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is. So we know something about where Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is buried. You can visit it today, and we know a little bit, as we know from the Talmud, a little bit about the end of his life. This is just a cute story. It doesn't matter, how do you understand it? Don't ask me now. We only have like 10 minutes or so. But source number 9 is just something to think about. You might have heard of it before. The Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, after Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi died, he used to come back every Friday night to make Kiddush for his family. It's not me, it's the Gemara, right? Right? The Gemara relates it happened on a certain Shabbat Eve, right? That a neighbor came by and called and knocked at the door, right? And again, who opens the door? The maid servant, right? Source number 9. She said, "Be quiet, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is sitting." And when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi heard that his maid servant revealed the fact that he came back every Friday night, right? He didn't come again, so as not to cast aspersions on other righteous people who similarly, chose not to go and visit their families every Friday night. So it's an interesting story. Don't ask me what to make of it. It's not really the topic at hand, other than it tells us that Amte the Rebbe was entrusted with being the gatekeeper to Rebbe, not only when he was alive, but even when he was a ghost, friendly ghost. But nonetheless, it's interesting that she makes an appearance there as well. However you understand that story, it's just interesting that Amte the Rebbe is found there as well. But what do we see? So far we've seen Amte the Rebbe as someone who probably was Jewish. Maybe one source, the Yerushalmi, maybe not. Let's assume she was Jewish. She was in the house of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. She viewed Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi as her posek, right? That when it came to mikvah, she followed what he said. She seemed to have absorbed a lot of the lessons, a lot of the language, the lingo, the philology, the interpretation of the words. She would be at times Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi corrected her, like when it came to dealing with the weasels, right? So she was familiar, but just like Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi changed his ways, sometimes she had to change her ways, and we have this instance where she does do something halachically significant in creating a cherem on the man who is slapping or beating his adult child, but through the prism of so that's halachically significant. That's the next stage. But the question is, what does it really tell us about her stature? Right? The fact that she was able to taste food, even at the advanced age of 92, is meant to tell us something about how she was viewed in the eyes of the rabbis. But what else? What else do we know? And this last source that we're going to spend a little bit of time on, the Gemara in Ketubot 103b, source number 10, is the most explicit and significant halachic story that includes the Amte the Rebbe. The story itself, you wouldn't necessarily see it as tremendously halachically significant. The way it's interpreted by as great a posek as Rabbi Moshe Feinstein brings it into a way that's very important as we think about end-of-life care. We'll see in a moment. Source number 10 is related on the day that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi died. The sages decreed a fast and begged for divine mercy so that he would not die, right? Until the end. Until the end, they were hoping, they were praying, they were fasting that he should not die. They said anyone who says that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi has died will be stabbed with a sword. In other words, not only were they praying that he should live, but there was a little bit of denial that was already creeping in. They couldn't imagine a Talmudic world without Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So they were sort of building these defenses. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Right? the maid servant of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi ascended to the roof. Right? She's taking a very forward role here. What does she say? She goes to the roof and she says as follows: the upper realms are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and the lower realms are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. She says, in this moment in time, either she's reading the, we don't necessarily have to say that she had some sort of Ruach HaKodesh, but she knew that this was a moment in time where he was sort of in between life and death. The idea, the language being that they're calling for him here on this world, they want him to live, but the angels, the celestial beings, are calling for him up in heaven. And so, what does she say? Ante the Rabbi perhaps knew him, spent more time with him than almost anyone, perhaps more than anyone. What does she say? May it be the will of God that the lower worlds should impose their will upon the upper worlds. Right. So first she prayed that he should survive, that he should live. That's what they want here. That's what they feel they need. They're being resolute and denial should he not survive. So at first she said that the lower world's prayer should win, and they should be able to. He should survive. However, when she saw how many times he would enter the bathroom, move his phylacteries, exit and put them back on, and how he was suffering with his intestinal disease, right? Every minute, every time, he would open and close, right? Take off the tefillin, take on the tefillin, take off the tefillin, and how he was suffering. Then she changed her mind and she said, may it be the will of God that the upper world should impose their will upon the lower worlds. She prayed for his death. Right? Sages, meanwhile, would not be silent, right? So in other words, they would not stop praying. They wanted Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi to survive at all costs, perhaps even if he would no longer be in a position to lead them, right? Just his living being. Right? The fact that they knew that there was a world in which Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi lived, existed, even if he wasn't functional, for them that would have been enough. So they continued to pray. So she took a jug, right? And the idea being is so long as they were praying and praying, he was surviving, right? He was surviving. And at first she thought that was great. But then she realized that she felt that this was not the way to go. So she took a jug and threw it from the roof to the ground. Big noise. They stopped davening. They were momentarily silent and refrained from begging for mercy, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi died. Right? It has echoes of the David HaMelech story, right? David HaMelech, right? As long as he kept saying to him, learning, wasn't going to die, and then he gets distracted and he dies. Okay, there could be some overlap there, but it's interesting. She takes a leading role. She takes a leading role in a way that's contrary to the approach that all of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's other students were taking. So what do we learn? Like, why are we told this story? Are we indicting her for causing Rebbe to die before his time? What's the takeaway? So it's not necessarily completely clear. If you look on the last page, we'll go to source 13 first, and then we'll go back. First of all, source 13, the Rush in Moed Katan tells us the story. It disagrees with the Rambam. We said that, remember the story in Moed Katan is where the maid puts someone in cherem for slapping his adult son, and the Rambam says it doesn't prove anything about her stature, because even if she was of the lowest stature, it's still cherem is appropriate. But the Rush disagrees. Just look at the last line in bold, underlined in the Rush. Vaha shivcha hayaba chachma yetera. This slave, this maid, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was wise, very wise, chachma yetera, v'yirat chet, and had reverence of God. Right? She was a yirat yireya shemayim, and she was a chachama, right? V'lo ratzu lishkol atzmam kenegda ad shenizkeku lo gedolei hador v'yitiru lo. The Rush says no. The reason why they were very reluctant and hesitant to uproot or absolve the excommunication that she made is because of her stature. was a great woman. She was wise. She was revered God, right? And therefore, they wanted to have all their ducks in order before they were going to overrule the cherem that she made. But so if that's the case, then perhaps through the prism of the Rush and Moed Katan, again, the Gemara in Ketubot that tells us the day Rebbe died and the role that his maid played is without judgment. We don't know, right? Did she do a good thing? Did she do a bad thing? So based on the Rush in Moed Katan, we could suggest, if we had an approach, if there was someone who said so, we can understand interpreting it as this Amta the Rebbe can be a source for halachic jurisprudence, for halachic decision making. What's that decision? So we'll fast forward from Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, 1800 years or so to Moshe Feinstein. And this, if you look on source number 11, let me just move that back. Source number 11, where Moshe is dealing with the following case. Hinei badavar, im yesh anashim cholim ke'elu, she'ein litain lahem eze minei refuot la'arich chayeihem ketzat yoter. Right? If there are people who are so sick, whether it's required to give them, whether it's required to intervene to prolong their life just for a little bit. In other words, the prognosis is terminal, but there is the possibility of extending the life for a short period of time. So Rav Moshe Feinstein says, "Hinei mefurish b'ktuba reish daf kuf daled be'uvda de b'tirato shel Rabbi." Right? He turns to our case, source number 10. Debo Rabbanan Rachmi. The rabbis want to intervene spiritually by praying. Right? Their prayers helped. He didn't die. But, right, Aval lo sheitrape. He was not healed. He was surviving, but he was not healed. Ukesherata amte Rebbe. Second line, towards the end, and when his maid saw Shekamet Star Tuva, he was in tremendous pain, anguish. Amra, she said, right? Maybe your will that those who want him in heaven should prevail, and their prayer should be heard over those who want to keep him here, because the prayers of those on earth are not affecting a complete recovery. Right? But the rabbis were not buying into this idea of the maid. So shaklakuza shadre me'igra la'ara ishtiki merachame menach nafshe Rebbe. Right, we're on the fourth line down. Right, that's the story that they kept praying. So she distracted them for a minute. Menachat Gemara. What's the point of this story? It's sort of left hanging. We don't know what the point of this story is. But in light of what we know about Amta the Rebbe, especially as interpreted by the Rush, Menachat Gemara lashmina sheika lefamim. The Gemara is coming to tell us that there are times. Right? It's possible that if a person is experiencing pain, and there are no interventions that are healing them, that are allowing for a recovery, there's been a lot of prayers and interventions to seek a recovery, and it has not happened. Then it may be at times okay to pray that a person dies. The Ramosha is like the Rush. She was wise. We can learn something from her. And he says, as we've learned together, there are a number of times where the rabbis learn things from her, not just in terms of linguistics, but also in terms of midot, and also in terms of the power of one's speech to enact excommunication. Right, 3 lines from the bottom. Vayin Baran Nedarim Reish Mem. Right, the Nedarim says Al Hadar Mefarsh Gemara Hadar of Dimi Dahamar Kol Shin Mevakar Chola Ein Mevakish Lo Rachamim Lo Sheyechev Lo Sheyamut. This is sort of a side point, but I wanted to give you the full picture of what Ramosha says here. Right, there's a different Gemara Nedarim that says that if you don't visit someone, you're not really in a position to pray for them, neither that they should live nor that they should die. Right? The implication is that at times it can be legitimate to pray Sheyamut. It's possible that at times, right, that praying for, not necessarily praying for their recovery may be appropriate. Right? It's impossible for that person to continue to survive. They're in a tremendous amount of pain. Fine. Right? They came in the Chazay Amte de Rabbi. Last line, since the maid of Rabbi saw the come stire, since he was in pain, Amar Yiratzon Shechofu Elyonim Etachtonim, which he under, right? It's sort of like a nice language that the upper prayer should overcome the lower prayers. You know what she was praying for? That he should die. That's what Moshe says. Klomar Diliamut Rabbi. Right? That it's not the entire tshuva, but just as a parting thought, certainly this is very relevant for the age in which we live, where prolonging life, the technology to allow for prolonging life has continued to develop. One could suggest perhaps even faster than the technologies for healing, than there is the technologies for prolonging life. Again, these are not things that you can talk about in the abstract. They always have to be dealt with patient by patient, but nonetheless, there is something that we see here. And Moshe Feinstein says there's something to be learned from this seemingly agadic tale, from the death of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and the role that his maid, the Amte de Rabbi played in this story that could teach us something very relevant and very important for us when it comes to medical ethics in the 21st century. And the story is told in her name. And that halacha, based on the Russian Moed Katan, Rav Moshe Feinstein says we give her credit for that. And sort of going back to the beginning, someone like that, obviously, it's not surprising that she was zocha, tarichas yamim, that she was very functional and vibrant, even at 92 years old. Right now, we get a sense of why it makes sense that we attribute such blessing to her, because of the fact that, as Rav Moshe and the Rush say, she was a chachama, she was a Yoreat Shemayim, she was someone who was close to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, utilized her innate talent and her proximity to something, and her circumstances to maximize her potential, even as a maid, to be remembered for in perpetuity in the Talmud as someone who taught us something. Okay, any questions? Otherwise, we will wrap up. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the anonymous sponsor of the series, and I'm taking suggestions for my next series, probably after the summer. Ghosts. We have one, Rabbi Hanasi. I'm sure there's more ghosts. I'll have to think.